webinar with the theme Vilifying Wildlife in the Age of Pandemics, Confronting Fears and Misconceptions. It's a very timely and relevant topic, and we need to be talking and having conversation about this, since wildlife is often mentioned again and again as the origin of several newly emerging pathogens. We need to be talking about what is the impacts of that kind of conversation to the conservation and to the emerging diseases in general. As you know, 60 to 70% of emerging diseases originate, especially from animals, especially from wildlife. So it is important to talk about how wildlife is perceived and what are the challenges of wildlife conservation given this whole situation. And it is also very important to talk about how the media frame and also package the information, the facts or the quasi-facts that is like fully dispersed around the world in a way that to balance between facts and sensationalism. We have three very prominent subject matter person to talk with us today, Dr. John Epstein from EcoHealth Alliance, a global nonprofit leading scientific research into the critical connections between human, animal, and environmental health. We have Simone McCarthy from South Asia, Southeast China Morning Post, Hong Kong-based English language newspaper founded in 1903. So it's been around for a while. And also we have Prof. Datuk Tajuddin Abdullah. I hope he's here with us today. I hope he's logged in already. A fellow of Academy of Science Malaysia and professor of wildlife conservation at University Malaysia Terengganu. So he's very famous for wildlife conservation, has published papers and all that. So we're hoping to hear from him today. Okay, before we proceed, let me share with you the agenda so that everybody is in the same platform of what and how the program will be run today. So hopefully everybody can see this. Yes. Okay, so we're going to have the welcoming remarks from Prof. Abdul Rahman Omar. He's the chairperson of MyOHUN and Dean of Faculty of Botany and Medicine, UPM. And then a little bit different than maybe other webinars that you have been before, we're doing a poll, very short polls, to see your level of understanding and your frame of mind in terms of the topic by which we will be discussing today. There'll be 3 polls, each before each presenter presented their materials. After poll 1, we have our first speaker who will be deliberating on understanding the ecology of disease emergence, and then followed by poll 2, right before Simone McCarthy will speak on confronting public perception, confronting public fear, risk communication 101. And then we have poll 3, which is relevant to the wildlife conservation in the age of pandemic topic, which will be presented by Prof. Datuk Dr. Muhammad Tajuddin Abdullah. So just a small housekeeping for everyone. This session is fully recorded and will be uploaded on YouTube channel. So for whatever reason, if you miss some parts of this session, you may later log on to YouTube and then watch this whole presentation. You can also watch this session on Facebook live stream. All participants' sound are muted, is muted to ensure smooth running of the webinar. As the speaker speaks, I would like to remind you to please use the chat box to type your question. The speakers may address the question directly if they can, or we can leave it to the end of the session after the third speaker spoke so that we can go through the panelists with the questions. Please make your question public so that others can see. And so again, about the polling, please make sure that you try to answer these polls. I'm going to stop sharing. Okay, we're gonna start with the opening remark from Prof. Abdurrahman Omar, the chairman of MyOHUN. He's a veterinary immunologist and virologist. He's also the dean of Faculty of Veterinary Medicine, UPM. I hand over the screen to you, Prof.
Thank you very much, Prof. Latifah. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. A very good morning to all. Also, good evening, depending from where you are joining us this webinar. As what highlighted by Prof. Latifah, this webinar joining, we have many participants at the moment joining from Asia and also from Europe and from US. I've been informed by the Secretariat we have more than 33 participants from more than 33 countries joining us this morning. Okay. I'd like to start by wishing you all my personal best for your health and safety in this very difficult time of COVID-19. Okay, welcome to today's webinar entitled Vilifying Wildlife in the Age of Pandemics, Confronting Fears and Misconceptions. As what Prof. Latifah mentioned, webinar is organized by Malaysian One Health University Network. On the behalf of MyOHUN, thank you very much to all the participants for joining the webinar, and my profound appreciation to all the speakers for able to make the time to be expert panels to deliberate the topic that we have on hand and to share your views and your ideas and so forth. As all of you are aware, today, 3rd of November, we celebrate One Health Day. I think this is the fourth or fifth anniversary we celebrate this One Health Day, and this webinar is actually to commemorate this One Health Day. Probably all of you know that One Health Day is a global campaign that celebrates and brings attention to the need for a One Health approach, how we can actually address shared health threats and the human, animal, and environment interface. And the organizing of this webinar today is very timely, as all of us have now witnessing an unprecedented pandemic of the 21st century with COVID, with a very strong linkage to wildlife. And of course, this webinar is also a very important venue to remind all of us the importance of animals, especially those that comes from wildlife animals, how they actually can be the impetus in the emergence of infectious disease outbreaks that what we've seen before this. I'm pretty much sure you have heard about diseases like Ebola, Nipah virus have been very happened first detected in 1998 in Malaysia, and of course we have a few strains of bird flu such as H5N1, H7N9, and of course several coronavirus have been become very important emerging diseases such as SARS, MERS, and COVID-19. And we have heard about COVID-19. We know about the causative agent COVID-19, the SARS-CoV-2, and we know it's a coronavirus, and it originated from bats. And I'm pretty much sure, John, you're going to talk a lot about this virus and how it comes from bats and so forth. But until now, we were not able to pinpoint exactly what is the intermediate animal hosts that actually have spurred or played the main role, how it actually emerged and how it transmitted the virus to human. And of course, looking into the behavior of coronavirus, how the virus have a very wide host range and ecology, I think is going to be a very monumental task if we were to really track back how it all started. But what we know now, there are a lot of hotspots areas that might have triggered the spillover of this COVID-19 virus. And what we also know nowadays, there's a lot of factors such as climate change, deforestation, habitat encroachment, and wildlife trade. All these activities making very close contacts and conflict between animals and humans, and this actually really perpetuate for the spillover to take place. To precisely predict whether a spillover will escalate into an epidemic or a pandemic is actually almost impossible. But what the public should do, as an experts, as people that work in this area, we should inform the public about the threat of diseases from animals, especially in terms of wildlife and spillover. And of course, today's seminar, we have what been said by Prof. Latifah. We have gathered all these renowned experts from area, veterinarians, epidemiologists, conservationists, journalists that deal on these issues of spillovers, zoonotic diseases, and they're going to be. I'm pretty much sure they're going to be a very exciting deliberation discussion on this topic that what we want to do this morning. And of course, as you can see now, we are now living in a world of IoT. Everybody have gadgets and information is at our fingertips. I would say that when we have pandemic in hand, we have also infodemic. We have overwhelming information, abundant of information, and the public need to be well informed so that the information they have on hand is actually really the right information. So that we need to do the due diligence to confront fears between misconceptions whenever it comes to wildlife and its spillover. Okay. As probably many of you know, MyOHUN, I'm the chairman of the MyOHUN, and we first established in 2012. Currently, MyOHUN, a university network, we have about 17 members from the local universities. Even though we are a university network, we are a very unique organization. We have a few governmental agencies as our network members. We have members from Ministry of Health, Department of Veterinary Service, Department of Wildlife. We have also members from Malaysian Agriculture Research Development Institute, and we have also members from the National Disaster Management Agency as our network members. So our network members have been very active. They involved in many activities at national and international level, giving advice, technical advice and knowledge when it comes to issues related to zoonosis and One Health. And the secretariat or the national coordinating office for MyOHUN is actually based at the Faculty of Veterinary Medicine, University of Putra, Malaysia. And MyOHUN is part of the network under the Southeast Asia One Health University Network, SIHUN, based in Bangkok. And under the so-called University Network under One Health, we work closely with US universities, and we've been funded by USA. So since our establishment in 2012, the support from SIHUN, the support of our US partners have been fantastic. Today we have grown into reputable networks. Then we are looking forward to work with in establishing a sustainable One Health workforce capacity, that we were able to cross-sectional competencies when it comes to prevent and to detect and respond to infectious disease threat in this region. I think without further ado, once again, thank you very much to all the speakers for accepting our invitation, for spending your time to deliberate the topic that we have today on wildlife and how spillover can take place and how we can actually handle all the issues about fear and misconceptions. My appreciation also goes to the coordinator of MyOHUN and the moderator of the webinar, Prof. Latifah, and of course to MyOHUN team for organizing the webinar. To all the participants, thank you very much for joining this webinar. I hope you will have a very fruitful discussion. All the best. Stay healthy and safe, and thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof, for that very nice welcoming remarks. So thank you, Prof. Tash just joined us. Thank you for being with here today. Prof, how are you doing? So we will proceed with the program. Welcome to all of those who just joined us. On your right, you should be seeing two poll questions. Admin, I am not seeing the questions. All right, thank you so much. All right, so please answer these questions within the time that you have been given, and we will end this poll in 2 minutes. Okay, thank you so much for answering the full questions. May we have the results, please? Okay, so for the question number 1, how many of you think selective culling is necessary? 52 did not answer. 29 said this is outrageous. 38 says maybe. And only 24 says this is absolutely necessary. So in your lifetime, how many only 60 of you have never had and consumed any type of wild animals. 6 cannot remember, so maybe that's a good thing. And 27 says yes, they have at least once in their lifetime consumed wild animals. So given that kind of like frame, maybe we move on to the first presenter for today. I'm going to read to you his bio. He has a long bio. Dr. Jonathan Epstein is the Vice President of Science and Outreach at EcoHealth Alliance, a science-based NGO in New York. He's a vet and epidemiologist. His research focuses on ecology of zoonotic viruses that impact animals and people, particularly those associated with bats. So when I first knew John, I think people call him Batman, of course, behind his back, not in front of him. So, such as Nipah, Ebola, emerging coronavirus. In term 4, Dr. Epstein was part of the team that discovered that bats were the reservoir of SARS coronavirus in China. And in 2012, he and colleagues first identified MERS-CoV in bats and camels in Saudi Arabia. He has served as technical consultant for WHO, OIE, FAO, Institute of Medicine Forum of Microbial Threats, and the Smithsonian Institute. He holds adjunct appointments at Tufts University, Columbia University, Mount Sinai School. The list goes on. He has published in research in leading journals like Science, Nature, Cell, PNAS, and his work has been extensively featured in news and other media, including recent PBS documentaries, Spillover, Zika, Ebola and Beyond, and PR in 60 Minutes. So all I can say is, John, I'm so happy I knew you before you were famous. If not, we would not have been able to engage you today. So you have the floor, you have the audience.
Thank you very much, Latifa. It is a pleasure to be here, and thanks for putting on a really timely and important discussion, and for inviting me to be a part of it. So good morning to everybody. You know, it's true, I've been working in Malaysia since about 2003, and it's always been exciting and a real pleasure, because Malaysia really has been a leader in One Health, placing a lot of value in understanding the dynamics between people and livestock and wildlife and the diseases we share. And it really stems from a very personal experience that you've had with Nipah virus back in 1998. And when a nation goes through the emergence and an outbreak of a zoonotic disease, it really allows people to understand those connections from a very personal standpoint. And I think perhaps the world, is experiencing that now with COVID-19. And so I wanted to use my time this morning to start off with a discussion of really how diseases like COVID-19 or Nipah virus or other zoonotic diseases emerge from wildlife reservoirs. Because I think if there's one point I would like to make in the theme and spirit of understanding the role that wildlife play in our health, it is that the single biggest cause for zoonotic disease emergence is us, our people. And to really appreciate that, I think it helps to think about the context by which pathogens emerge. And so I like this diagram here, this figure, because it's a very simple way to think about the fact that in any given species of animal, humans included, we all have our suite of microbes, viruses, bacteria, what have you, that normally circulate within our communities. Some of them cause disease and some of them don't. And of course, every time we make contact with each other, there's an opportunity for pathogens to jump or spread from one individual to another. And the same goes for animals. And in the wild, in natural ecosystems or environments, whether it's the jungle or grasslands, sometimes even urbanized environments, when you have communities of animals that are interacting with each other, whether it's through predator-prey interactions or whether it's shared food resources like a watering hole. There is an opportunity occasionally for microbes like viruses to jump from their normal host, the animals in which they normally circulate, into a new species. And sometimes that causes disease, and sometimes it doesn't. The problem is when it happens deep in the forest in wildlife populations, we almost never notice because we're just not paying attention. But in the same vein, when wildlife and livestock interact, and there's a route of transmission available, what we call an interface between wild animals and livestock, and a pathogen like a virus jumps from its natural wildlife reservoir into livestock, and that causes disease and mortality, we do tend to notice because our livestock are precious to us. They're valuable as a commodity, as part of our livelihood, as part of our life. And we do notice when they get sick and they die. Okay, and so that is the first stage when pathogens have the ability to jump. And people have contact with wildlife either directly through activities such as hunting or sometimes through contamination of food resources by wildlife in the same way that livestock do. And that's that first stage of emergence, that initial spillover event when an animal virus or pathogen jumps from its natural host into a human population or a livestock population. And sometimes we see outbreaks occur, and those outbreaks are often brief and intense. And if that human population is isolated, if it's remote, if it's deep in the forest, then that pathogen, if it's able to spread from person to person, will cause an outbreak, and it will spread through the population until it exhausts the available susceptible people. And people either die or they survive, and then the pathogen runs out of people to infect and it goes away. So you get these short bursts. When human populations become more connected, as we are in today's world, there is opportunity through travel and human movement for pathogens that are efficiently able to spread from person to person to move through human populations. And that's that second stage of emergence, when a pathogen has the opportunity to become endemic, when it can persist within a human population without the need for contribution from the original animal reservoir. Okay, and in a sense, it is what we're seeing now with SARS coronavirus 2. And we get to that third stage of pandemic spread, which is global travel, where people can easily be around the world within 24 hours, then we truly see how connected we are, and we get large regional or global pandemics. And so we have an example with SARS-CoV-2, the virus causing COVID-19, that has emerged likely from a bat reservoir, which was mentioned earlier. We don't know exactly how. We don't know whether it went directly into people or via other animals. But the point is that here's a virus that was genetically predisposed to already be able to spread efficiently among people. And so we're watching it slowly establish itself endemically in human populations. And that's being done through our connection and through the virus's transmissibility. So we're living this process of emergence as we speak. Okay. Excuse me, I'm trying to advance the slides and getting notes about annotation. 1 second, please. Let me try sharing my screen again. Okay. Now, fortunately, the process by which viruses emerge from wild animals into human populations is actually pretty complicated. It's not so easy. Otherwise, we'd see so many more pathogens emerging than we do. And we are starting to see an acceleration of zoonotic diseases emerging, zoonotic pathogens. But a lot of things have to line up in order for this to happen. You have the host ecology. So this is the animals that carry viruses, whether they're bats or rodents, non-human primates, what have you. Any animal has to be actively circulating virus. And I'll, for the sake of this discussion, talk about viruses, as they are typically the types of pathogens that emerge and cause epidemics in people. But you need to have the right host ecology, a population of animals that are actively infected and shedding. And then there has to be enough individuals infected so that if there is a route of transmission, a way for that pathogen to get from an animal into people, that it can occur, okay, that there is a possibility. So that could be directly as people contact animals. It could be indirectly as livestock and wildlife interact, and then people interact with livestock. It could be food contamination. But a lot of other things have to happen. The pathogen has to be able to survive for a time in the environment in case there isn't direct contact. And then human populations have to actually be susceptible, able to be infected with this pathogen and spread it to other people. So assuming you have all these right conditions lining up, only then do you really have a pathway to emergence. So it's bad when it happens, but the good news is that because this process is so complex, it's actually easy to disrupt. If you knock any one of these elements out of alignment, it makes it that much harder for pathogens to emerge. And that is the strategy we need to take when it comes to preventing zoonotic diseases from emerging. Now, we actually have a really good idea of where in the world we're most likely to see zoonotic diseases emerge. This is analysis of emerging disease hotspots based on factors such as human demography, wildlife biodiversity, livestock populations, and importantly, dynamic processes such as land use change, ecological change that tend to drive viruses to spill over from their wildlife reservoirs into livestock and people. And so while it is difficult to know exactly when or perhaps which virus it will be that emerges, we have a pretty good handle on where it's likely to happen, and we also know pretty well how it's likely to happen. One of the most important drivers of zoonotic disease emergence is land use change. Again, human activities, things we do that alter the environment around us, that put us and our livestock into closer contact, that allows for viruses to move from their natural reservoir into people. And land use change is responsible for about 30% of emerging diseases. And that could be conversion from pristine forest into agricultural land. It could be conversion of agricultural land into urbanized environments or suburban environments. It's really, the important thing is the dynamic process. And then what matters is the biodiversity or the assemblage of animals that are present in that area, that ecosystem that is being altered and bringing us into closer contact. Now, one example of urbanization, which brought people and wildlife into closer contact, was from a study that I was involved in several years back in Brisbane, Australia, looking at Australian white ibis. And I like this because it's a nice example of how human activities can tip the ecological balance, and how wildlife, it doesn't necessarily have to be the rare or exotic species. It's often the common and adaptable wildlife species that have the most opportunity to make contact with people. And so here are ibis in their natural environment, which is patrolling mudflats in coastal waters, looking for crustaceans and invertebrates. But in suburban Brisbane, and this was about 15 years ago, there was an issue with open landfills. And the theme of wildlife provisioning becomes so important in terms of understanding some of the ways in which we actually enable contact between humans and wildlife. And in this case, open landfills provided an unnaturally abundant food resource for ibis. And they learned to, instead of foraging for crustaceans in the mudflats, they learned to nest and settle around these landfills and use their long hooked beaks to poke into garbage bags and pull out food waste. And they became overabundant. The birds were incredibly successful. In fact, what you see here on this garbage pile that's white is pretty much an ibis. So these birds were patrolling across the landfills, picking up food and becoming overabundant. And it became a real problem because there were bird strikes on airplanes. These birds were moving into suburban areas, becoming a real nuisance. But also there was a lot of opportunity for contact between people and birds, and potential for disease transmission. And here's an example in a park where people were feeding ibis. And so again, provisioning, which means providing food for wildlife that would be unnatural. So people would picnic, they'd feed these birds, birds associated humans as a source of food. And here you have ibis that are splashing and bathing in a water tap. And literally moments later, two boys are coming to fill their water bottles with water from that tap. And if you imagine that these birds were carrying salmonella or influenza virus, and it was being excreted, that splashing around in water could contaminate that water source. And indeed, when we tested these ibis for pathogens, we found avian influenza virus, Newcastle disease, and salmonella. And another example of the risk of disease transfer, in this case, a livestock interface, was that that poultry farms had open laying sheds, and ibis had learned that the laying sheds were also a source of food. And so every day when the farmers quit for the day, and it was just the hens and the eggs they were dropping onto racks, ibis would come into the poultry sheds, roam up and down the aisles, and take those long bills and grab eggs off of the racks, and often, poke those bills into piles of chicken feces underneath the cages as well. A perfect opportunity either for ibis to contaminate the hens with salmonella, with excretia and salmonella, or to pick something up from that farm. And because they're free-ranging wildlife, they could move to another farm and spread something like Newcastle disease, which is incredibly damaging to poultry, to chicken populations. Something a little closer to home now is the experience that Malaysia had with Nipah virus, an example of agricultural intensification. So here is a good example of, as the world and the human population is growing and our demand for animal protein is increasing, we're starting to see the growth and intensification of livestock production, which means that rather than, small or moderately sized backyard farm operations where you might have a couple of hundred head of cattle or pigs, we started to see large industrialized farms being developed. And this is happening all over the world, of course, whether it's poultry or swine or cattle. And when you have large intensified operations that are centralized, and if there isn't adequate biosecurity, there's opportunity for wildlife and livestock to make contact. And that's certainly what happened back in 1998 on Leong Sing Nam Farm up in Ipoh, where there was a farm, which many of you are familiar with, that had more than 30,000 head of pigs. But also on that property were fruit orchards, something which was a very common practice at the time. And here, this created not only provisioning of food for large fruit bats, which it turns out were the reservoir for Nipah virus, but it also created an interface where as bats were coming in to feed on the orchards, on the plentiful mangoes and rambutan on this farm, because the trees were planted next to the animal enclosures, as bats were dropping bits of fruit laced with saliva or other excretia and occasionally contaminated with Nipah virus, and pigs were able to eat that fruit, therein lies the interface between bats, who would normally never have contact with pigs or other livestock, and the pigs themselves being able to pick up a bat virus, compounded by the fact that farmers would often throw or feed dropped fruit that couldn't be sold, but perhaps was bitten by bats or other wildlife, would feed that to their livestock as a source of nutrition, which is logically very intuitive and makes a lot of sense, but creates that interface or opportunity for spillover between bats or wildlife and livestock, which is how we imagine that the emergence event originally happened. And then it was the size and scale, the intensiveness of the farm itself, that once Nipah virus spilled into the pig population, it was allowed to circulate and perpetuate within that pig population that was constantly producing new pigs. And you got a long-term chronic kind of outbreak situation. And as pigs moved through the country off the farms, they were able to spread the virus to other pigs and, of course, ultimately to people. And that is, it's an iconic illustration. And I know that, again, this audience is quite familiar with this, but this is happening all over the world, where there are livestock operations that don't have adequate separation between wildlife and the livestock that are being produced. And there is the risk. And so as we think about producing animal protein to feed growing human populations, we also have to be very aware and very cognizant of the potential for viruses to jump from wildlife into those livestock through a number of different ways. And interestingly, the Nipah virus story in Bangladesh is quite different than it was in Malaysia. Malaysia, of course, you just had the one outbreak in 1998-99, and then it was contained and stopped with the destruction of farms and the stop of movement of sick pigs. In Bangladesh, there are nearly annual outbreaks of Nipah virus encephalitis in people who are getting infected directly from bats by drinking date palm sap. This is a traditional cultural drink that is harvested by shaving the bark off palm trees and collecting the sap overnight, and then drinking it raw and fresh in the morning, or occasionally allowing it to ferment and drinking it as tari, or palm wine. In either case, bats have learned to exploit this human-provided resource. Again, wildlife provisioning. Bats would never normally have access to date palm sap. It is not something, their teeth aren't strong enough to strip the bark off palm trees, nor would they. Okay, they eat fruits or pollen or nectar. But they learned to exploit this sweet drink as it was flowing down the trunk of the trees. So especially in the winter months when sap tends to be harvested, bats will come in and lick the stream of sap and contaminate occasionally the date palm sap pots with saliva, other excreta, and Nipah virus. And then people get infected that way. No livestock intermediary necessary, although we have evidence that livestock, domestic animals in Bangladesh, such as pigs and cattle and goats, have indeed been exposed to Nipah or related virus. Now, just back in 2018 and 2019, there were also outbreaks of Nipah virus in southern India. Now, there had been, prior to that, outbreaks of Nipah virus in the Northeast in West Bengal, which is ecologically and culturally very similar to Bangladesh in that people also harvest date palm sap. And so that there were outbreaks in 2001 and 2007, just on the border of Bangladesh, wasn't entirely a surprise. And the bats, of course, which are a Pteropus bat that's related to the bats you have in Malaysia, those bats are abundant across South Asia, across the Indian subcontinent. Pteropus medius is the species. They're present across Bangladesh and across India and up into Nepal and down into Sri Lanka. Now, if you had been paying attention, you know that bats in the Pteropus genus carry henipaviruses, Nipah and related viruses pretty much across their range. So the fact that there was an outbreak in southern India and Kerala wouldn't be a surprise, but the difference there was that there is no date palm sap harvesting, and it was unknown exactly what the route of transmission was for the index case. So to this day, we're not entirely sure how the first person in this outbreak of 23 was exposed to Nipah, whether it was by eating dropped fruit or perhaps having contact with a domestic animal or other animal that was infected. And it's really important to understand how spillover happens and what that interface is if we hope to prevent a virus like Nipah from continually emerging. And I will say that in South Asia and Bangladesh, Nipah virus carries on average a 75% case fatality rate. So it is not efficiently transmitted from person to person, although it does spread among people, but it has a very high mortality rate. And so the concern with Nipah is that given enough opportunity, this or a related virus will one day come along that is efficiently able to be spread from person to person. And then we have a highly fatal, easily transmissible virus that could cause a widespread epidemic and a lot of problems. And so looking at the distribution of the types of bats that carry Nipah and related viruses, we have evidence that these bats carry henipaviruses throughout their range, from Australia, where it's Hendra virus, through Southeast Asia to South Asia, and even on the continent of Africa, where related bats carry henipaviruses. It's a very widespread. This entire family of old world fruit bats, the pteropodid bats, seem to carry related viruses. And we just don't have good enough surveillance or awareness to understand whether or not there are outbreaks of Nipah virus occurring in populations that have contact with bats that carry it, but where we're not noticing outbreaks of encephalitis or respiratory disease. So it is something we need. It's an example of a zoonotic virus that is repeatedly emerging, knocking on the door, that we need to pay better attention to, particularly in areas of the world where we know the virus exists, we know the bats are there, and we just don't know yet whether there have been outbreaks in people. Now, shifting from wildlife provisioning, let's talk a little bit about wildlife trade because it's relevant to the discussion now about COVID-19. But the original SARS coronavirus emerged in a live animal market in southern China, in Guangdong. And we really have a lot of good information about this process because there were really excellent investigations in the early phases, understanding that people in marketplaces that were trading wildlife and domestic animals were disproportionately being infected by SARS coronavirus. And ultimately, the virus was isolated from people in the markets in Guangdong, as well as civets and other animals in those markets. Now, originally, it was thought that civets were the reservoir for SARS coronavirus, but that didn't turn out to be the case, as we later learned that civets were being infected within the markets just as people were. And so part of the work I was involved in with colleagues from China and Australia was to track down where SARS coronavirus had come from. And it was a family of bats called horseshoe bats or rhinolophus bats that are common throughout southern China into Southeast Asia. And in fact, this family of bats extends all the way to Eastern Europe. So it's a very common and abundant small insectivorous bat. And since the early days of SARS coronavirus, we know that this group of bats, the Rhinolophus bats, carry a huge diversity of coronaviruses, many of them related to the original SARS coronavirus, and also carry viruses that are the most closely known relative to SARS-CoV-2. So this is an important group of bats in terms of zoonotic coronaviruses. But the point here is that the wildlife trade in general, pulling wildlife out of their natural environment into a concentrated area, an urban market or a large-scale market where different animals have the opportunity to interact with each other by virtue of cages being stacked on top of each other, animals being exposed to bodily fluids from other animals, being butchered and handled by people in unhygienic conditions. This creates a perfect storm or perfect environment for pathogens to jump from one species to another, including people. And it isn't just the markets that are risky, it's the entire chain, the entire process of pulling wildlife out of their natural environment, bringing them together in stressful and unhygienic conditions and transporting them often over land across multiple borders. Much of the wildlife that is transported to markets in China come from Southeast Asia. And that whole entire process can be an amplifier for viral transmission and risk. And it's something that we need to pay a lot of attention to prevent another coronavirus or other virus from emerging via the wildlife trade. And we know that once SARS, the original SARS epidemic ended in 2003, we continued to do research to understand the diversity of coronaviruses in horseshoe bats. And there are parts of southern China, particularly around Yunnan, where we know there are populations of horseshoe bats living in caves that continue to have coronaviruses circulating in those populations that have genetic elements of the original SARS coronavirus, and that have coronaviruses that are closely related to that original SARS coronavirus, and therefore it would have the potential to emerge again in human populations. So in addition to understanding that wildlife trade in and of itself presents risk for pathogen emergence, it can also happen at the community level just by exposure to wildlife. And this is something where we have to do a better job creating awareness at local levels. We have evidence that communities that are living around these bat caves of horseshoe bats have been exposed to bat coronaviruses, to SARS-like coronaviruses. These communities have antibodies. Up to 3% of the people have antibodies against SARS-like coronaviruses, showing that spillover is occurring even at the community level, not just in the markets. And that is something we also have to pay attention to because, again, these bats are abundant and widespread. And so understanding where communities are having high degrees of interaction with bats, whether it's entering the caves or hunting them. This creates opportunity for other coronaviruses to spill over that would have the potential, again, to spread among people, just like SARS-CoV-2. Now, the US has been subject to the importation of infectious zoonotic viruses as well through the pet trade. So another element of the wildlife trade, in addition to food, is the pet trade, which is a global industry worth billions of dollars. And back in 2004, we had an outbreak of monkeypox virus in the Midwest United States when we imported rodents from West Africa into the United States as part of the pet trade legally. And they were intermingled with North American rodents like prairie dogs and then distributed to different pet stores and animal shows throughout the Midwest. And people bought rodents that were infected with monkeypox, which was a totally exotic virus that we don't have in the US. Monkeypox can be quite serious, particularly in children, where there's about a 10% mortality rate. And here on the left of this screen, you see a young girl who had purchased a prairie dog and developed a pox lesion on her finger. She got infected and was one of about 70 people that were infected in this outbreak. And following that recognition of the importation of monkeypox, the US CDC banned the importation of African rodents. But the problem is it was a very specific policy that, of course, continued to leave us open to importation of rodents from South America or other parts of the world. And so we still have to grapple with this issue of how do we protect ourselves better from the importation of exotic animals. And it's really to think about the wildlife trade as a whole as being risky as we move animals and their pathogens around the world. And we need to improve surveillance in the wildlife trade, and in fact, really reduce demand for wildlife and make sure that we're not pulling animals out of the wild to supply pet and food markets if we can avoid it. And so just to finish up, how do we really solve this issue of wildlife being reservoirs, and to get into the idea that this is certainly not the fault of wildlife, okay? Because they carry viruses, it's not their fault that we're seeing emergence. It is squarely human activities. And the good news is it is within our power to reduce the risk of diseases from emerging. And this is an example of an illustrated book that we developed at EcoHealth Alliance with other partners under a USAID Predict program that really talked about at the community level how to live more safely with bats and indeed other wildlife by reducing contact with sick and injured bats, by avoiding eating dropped fruit. It was really just an effort to work at the community level. And that's the kind of last thing I want to say is that my personal view, and I know many of my colleagues, I'm not an advocate of all-out bans on wildlife use or wildlife trade, because I think that there are many cultures and many communities that depend on wildlife for sustenance, for their livelihoods. But I do think that what we need to do is combine working with local communities and local experts who understand the sociologic context by which people use wildlife to help reduce risk and also help reduce demand for wildlife going into the trade, coupled with legislation at federal levels to really restrict wildlife trade in the other sense as a luxury, as wildlife being pulled out of the forest and sent into markets where the risk is very high for disease emergence. And so we really need to restrict wildlife going into markets and also understand what's driving demand for wildlife and try to reduce that at local levels. And so lastly, just to make the point that emerging zoonoses are certainly a two-way street. And one of the concerns now, which is a fairly unique concern, but is that with so many people on the planet being infected with SARS-CoV-2, is there a risk that wildlife will be infected by us? Could this virus spill back into wild animal populations, including other bat species? We know that mink and mustelids are susceptible. We know cats are susceptible to this virus. And is there a real risk that humans will transmit this to wildlife populations where SARS-CoV-2 might establish itself in the wild in new geographies? And there are other examples of wildlife that do get infected with human pathogens too, and which can cause severe disease in animals, particularly great apes and our respiratory viruses. So it's something that we need to think about and grapple with as we think about our connection to nature and our health. And so in conclusion, it is us, it is human beings that are driving driving disease emergence. Okay, it is not wildlife, and wildlife should not be vilified, nor should we seek to eradicate wildlife as a solution. Rather, we need to learn to do a better job at living alongside and with nature. And so supporting One Health research that understands these relationships and seeks to study pathogen transmission and ecological interactions between wildlife and people, livestock. We need to strengthen the systems that protect us from disease emergence, strengthen our surveillance systems, the workforce that go out and are actually able to sample and test wildlife and livestock and people for the same viruses, to be able to respond more rapidly to an outbreak before it becomes a regional outbreak or a global pandemic. And that requires investment in our own infrastructure and our own people. And then studying and changing high-risk behaviors at the local level with communities, working with local experts appropriately in a local context, while working with governments and international organizations to set policy that will reduce demand and access to wildlife. So with that, I thank you for your attention. I'll end there, and I look forward to the discussion with my colleagues on the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John, for the fantastic and very comprehensive overview. If you look at the chat box, there's tons of questions written by the participants for you, and hopefully we can address some of that. I'm not sure whether we can address all, but perhaps we can address some of that during the Q&A session later. We have to move on to the next presentation, and you should be seeing another 2 poll questions on your right. And the poll questions is relevant to the next presentation topic. You have 2 minutes. Okay, maybe admin, can we see the results of the poll? So this nicely brings us to the next presentation. A lot of us are very overwhelmed, it seems, so with the amount of information that we are served with every day. So our next presenter is Ms. Simone McCarthy. Simone McCarthy is a news reporter with the South China Morning Post in Hong Kong, where she has been part of a team of reporters covering the COVID-19 pandemic and the research and development around understanding the novel coronavirus and controlling its spread. Originally, she is from the US and she has been reporting from Asia for the past 3 years, covering a range of social, political, and environmental issues. So we're very excited to have you today here, Simone. So please go ahead, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? I'll take that as a yes. So I'm so honored to be here and certainly humbled to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. Thank you for letting me take up a little bit of your time. I suppose I did want to start out with a little bit of a confession, and that's that I'm certainly not a hardened scientific reporter who's coming here today with my university degree in biology in my hands. But I think in a way that might be actually useful for our conversation, because instead I'm a general assignment reporter who, like many of my colleagues across the industry, was called on to cover this pandemic when it was just an outbreak back in January, and we needed more man and woman power covering this story. And so I've had to really, catch up quick, and have certainly relied on my interactions with the scientific community and with the available scientific research to hopefully do that. And so I guess I've tried to include a little bit about my observations of some of those interactions in the presentation as well. And I guess on that note, I'd also like to just personally thank the researchers and scientists. Oh, sorry, can you hear me okay? Yeah?
Please proceed, Simone. I think somebody accidentally unmuted themselves.
Oh, okay. Just wanted to check that you could hear me. All right, cool. I'll carry on. So yeah, so what I was going to say was just also to thank members of the scientific community as well for the time speaking to reporters like myself, sometimes on our really unrealistic tight deadlines. And in particular, I can specifically thank Dr. Latifa Hassan. And although I haven't had the opportunity to speak with Dr. John Epstein before, a number of his colleagues at EcoHealth Alliance in New York have also been really instrumental for me in my understanding of this bigger picture of the pandemic. So thank you. So I thought it might be useful actually to just start with sort of an overview of what happens when a big event like this starts to unfold and how actually a newsroom reacts. And then I'll get into some of the more specifics of our topic today as it relates to journalistic coverage of wildlife, wet markets, wildlife trade. I should note, I guess, as just by way of a disclaimer of sorts, that I'm not an editor at the South China Morning Post or specifically speaking for the newspaper, but I'm, I guess, please accept this as a humble desk reporter's observations about my own news organization, as well as our media colleagues across the industry, how we've all, in general, reacted to this story and come together to cover it. So as things began to, I'll sort of take us back to the end of December when we started getting information about the outbreak of a new virus in China. And so, what we actually did to start putting the story together. And so there's a few different levels and elements of reporting that are going on at this time when we're all scrambling to figure out what's happening. So The first, as I think we probably all remember, is December 30th. There was information that was coming out from originally shared in a group chat of doctors and other medical professionals with a warning that there had been a patient at a local hospital who had a virus that was similar to SARS, which was sort of rang a lot of alarm bells for people because, of course, China was also where the SARS epidemic began. And so when we start to pick up on that kind of noise on social media, there's a number of things that we have to do. It's social media, so of course, it's really critical that we need to verify, what is this group chat? Who are the people who might be a part of it? Is it reasonable that somebody who's a part of this chat may have access to this kind of information? Some of that can be done on social media, kind of checking, trying to verify people's identities, but then also needing to reach out to local sources, seeing who among the colleagues in a newsroom may have contact with people in that city, may know people in the medical community there. How do we figure out what's really going on? And then, of course, following right up on that, on December 31st, that was when the Wuhan health authorities sent out a notification that there had been a number of pneumonia cases linked to a seafood market in the city. And so at that time, that kicks in another side of our reporting, which is, what are the official statements? How are the authorities reacting? What are outside medical authorities and scientists thinking about the justification for what's going on in the government reaction? Why are there concerns coming up that are reminding us of SARS? All of these things, what are the facts that we know? What are some theories that we might be thinking about right now? And then it's always very important to communicate, what is it that we don't know? What are the missing layers of information here that scientists are telling us that they would like to know, that us, we as reporters really think that it's important to know? And how do we communicate that to our readers who are trying to figure out what's going on, what it is that we do know and what we don't know? And so I guess those are sort of the other really important layer within that is, as I mentioned, of course, contact with local sources, but then can we also have our own reporters on the ground? And so very quickly, already on January 4th, we had a small team of South China Morning Post reporters go to Wuhan and doing various different things, such as going to the hospitals, trying to speak with families there, as well as visiting the market, which in early cases were originally linked to. That market had already been shut down and sanitized, but one of my colleagues went to the outside of the market where there was officials were blocking off the entrance, and spoke with some of the stall keepers who were there hoping to get in, and they still had produce that was inside, and they were hoping that they might be able to get in and take some things out. There was also, I think, as many of us remember, there was a stall that had a menu that was also shared online about the different kinds of wildlife that they were selling at that stall, both butchered and live. And so, she was also trying to find out from the different stall keepers, were they aware that there was wildlife being sold at the market? Could she identify where that stall was, which I believe she was able to see the outside of that specific shop. And so that's, I guess, within those three parts: on the ground reporting, contacts with local sources, official statements and justification, and then what's going on social media. That's really how we mobilized to try and begin to cover this story and get to the bottom of what was going on. Now, very quickly, of course, a lot of the attention, both from the health authorities in China and also from the international community of experts and other observers who are watching this, everyone began to really focus their attention on the wet markets and the wildlife trade. And so for me, as a desk reporter in Hong Kong, as I'm starting to get out a lot of stories and try and respond to our readership around the world who are really trying to figure out what's going on. I mean, what is the connection between wet markets and an outbreak, or wildlife trade and an outbreak? Why has this become the focus? What do I need to know here? And so that was at the point where I felt like the most important thing was to start engaging the scientific community as well as health officials, and try and really expel out for people who are not familiar, what are the risks in the wildlife trade or with consumption of wildlife? Why have wet markets been involved in previous outbreaks? And so I think for many people in the scientific community, some of the points that Dr. Epstein just raised, for example, the fact that if you have a number of different animals from different species that are being stored together in crates that are maybe stacked on top of each other, or even in a situation where the animals are able to fight, these kinds of things, it raises an opportunity for a virus to jump from one species into another species. Maybe there's a recombination event that happens there, and then that creates an opportunity for a virus that may be able to infect humans, even spread between them. Similarly, China has a large legal wildlife trade, so there are a number of, there's a number of large-scale farms. So we have a number of animals of the same species that may be together. How does that enable a virus to spread very quickly through a population, perhaps mutate along the way, and again, create an opportunity to jump into a person? So kind of being able to describe these details for readers who are trying to figure out what's going on and are worried and concerned about the situation, I think that that for me was a really important aspect of what we were doing as we're putting articles out. The other side of that, of course, as I alluded to earlier, is what are the government health authorities saying? And we saw in China that on January 26th, the government issued a temporary ban on consumption and trade of wildlife. And then just less than a month later, on February 24th, they created a permanent ban, although it did have some exceptions, including medicinal use of wildlife products. And so, again, what is the scientific basis for this? What are scientists saying? Why does this make sense, or what might some of the nuances be within a ban like this? What are some of the implications, especially in 2016, there was statistics saying that I think 14 million people were employed in the legal wildlife in trade in China that year. So what kinds of government support is being set up? All of these questions are things that we want to make sure that we're addressing as we're covering this very complicated and nuanced issue. And for me, I think there's a lot of, when these kinds of topics emerge, one of the things that's really important as well when presenting coverage of this to readers is to understand, is there a consensus among experts about these issues? Is there a consensus among experts about what the risks are in the wildlife trade, for example? If I'm interviewing 8 scientists, are they all saying the same thing, along with the research also, the latest research also backing that up? Or are 5 of them saying one thing and 3 of them saying another? And how can I incorporate some of these nuances that are even happening within the scientific community into our coverage so that the public is aware of what the different dynamics are? So the other thing that's happening as we're learning more facts about what's going on the ground in Wuhan, and also the government is coming out with different statements, is that organizations and activist groups are also making different, calling for different actions to be taken. And another part of our job is to really try and make sense of this and explain. Of course, we have to cover, there's many prominent organizations coming out and making different statements like, this is the time that we should ban all international trade of wildlife, or we need to have a blanket ban on wet markets. So we need to also think about what some of the issues are at stake here, engage scientific experts to really think about, does everyone agree? Is there consensus that this is what needs to be done? What are some of the nuances? And so I think within this, there are a lot of cultural and socioeconomic contexts that should be considered. For example, with an international ban on wildlife trade, and Dr. Epstein alluded to this as well, what about communities where livelihoods are linked to wildlife trade? Is there a government support system that will help those people transition into another kind of wage earning, or is this just going to drive that trade underground potentially? So that's being able to, as a journalist, it's really not my job to say, yes, there should be this ban, or no, there should not be this ban. My job is to instead say there are prominent people that are calling for this on the one hand, but there are also these other issues that other scientists and health officials, government officials say need to be taken into account. Hopefully also being able to, a really important part of that is being able to engage experts and communities from around the world to the extent that we can, and trying to speak with people in different parts of the world about what the local ramifications may be for these kinds of things. Getting a lot of different voices into the conversation is always really, really important. And I think that's true in science, and that's certainly true in media. So I'll get into this a little bit more in the next slide, but I think there's also some there's also a lot of cultural specificities that, or misconceptions that come along with some of this as well. And for example, in the US, there was a number of politicians who were calling for a ban on wet markets in China. And I remember at that time I was speaking with a global health expert who's based in the US, but who is originally from China. And he was pointing out that, well, if you close a wet market in a rural town in China, that's the same thing as closing a supermarket in a suburban town in the United States. Where are people going to get their food? And so one of the things that we really try and do is provide that context. What is the social context here? What are the things that we need to be understanding that are relevant to this conversation? And so I included a few links at the bottom of this slide, which I don't think I have. They're both from videos that my colleagues made, and I don't think I have time to show a clip right now, but I believe that we'll be sharing this slide deck afterwards. So I think these are really excellent examples of how media can communicate to just try and raise some, provide some more context about how, for example, one of them is going in to visit a wet market here in Hong Kong, and just raising a bit more awareness about what the context is, what's happening in places like this, what are some of the recommendations that scientists are making, what is the scientific community saying about this. So I would definitely encourage you guys to check out those links there. However, there is certainly the other side of the really ugly side of what happened with the conversation, social media conversation, and media, of course, needing to engage this around the pandemic with conspiracy theories and racism and fake news. And this picture on the left here, you may recognize, was a video that went viral of a woman eating a bat soup. And this was used as an example of eating practices in China, and really became a springboard for a lot of racist commentary. And actually, it turned out that this video was taken by a travel blogger in the Western Pacific. It wasn't filmed in China. And so, I mean, this is a really straightforward example of how we need to verify social media. What is actually going on here? Was this video taken where people are saying it was taken? What is the context around this video? I think that's kind of social media verification 101 when we see something like this coming up. So we addressed this specific video, or one of the ways that we addressed this specific video was that a colleague of mine wrote an article about a number of racist jokes that were coming up around Chinese cuisine at that time, and she did some reporting around how that was cropping up on social media, and so just putting more of a cultural, or I guess social context around what's happening. And then it's not, of course, not just wildlife that's been vilified during this pandemic, but also scientists. And so a number of conspiracy theories around whether or not the virus could have emerged at a laboratory such as the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which was pinpointed in a number of the conspiracy theories. And there is really an important question around, especially in this age of social media, when there are so many different kinds of conspiracy theories that are kicking around on the internet now, and lots of different ways that those are amplified in different messaging platforms and social media platforms. And so we may be, as a newsroom, it's an important decision about when do you start engaging with these theories, because of course, we may be looking into something when we hear about it. We need to check. I mean, is it possible that this is true? How can we get to the bottom of that? But at the same time, when you start reporting on conspiracy theories, then you're also giving them a platform as well. So can you debunk that if it should be debunked? If you can say that it's not true without amplifying it, how do you engage it? And so when it became clear that theories about SARS-CoV-2 coming from a laboratory was really entering into mainstream conversation, and politicians are starting to talk about it and everything, we really did spend a lot of time trying to address this theory, and both by speaking with experts who had been involved in research at the Institute, outside experts about what they thought about the likelihood, those who were analyzing the genetic sequence of the virus, as well as and so again, being able to try and understand what is the scientific consensus around that, and how can we use what our work that we've done to understand that scientific consensus. How can we then present that in an article that maybe there are two sides to the story, but what is the overwhelming voice in this? How do we clearly explain that? And I think this is a little bit of a side note to the conversation on wildlife, but I think it's an important comment maybe about the relationship between scientists and journalists, because I was having a conversation at this time with a scientist who is not based in China, but who has done extensive work with the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And he mentioned to me in one of our conversations about this, well, these scientists at the laboratory don't have the live virus, referring to the virus that was identified that has a 96% genetic similarity to SARS-CoV-2. And so that kind of detail, if you don't really understand what that means, it may not really ring any kind of bell. But if I, as a reporter, if I have a scientist saying, this is actually a very important detail, it matters because you're not going to be able to replicate a virus if you just have the genetic information, but you don't have the live virus, then that's a piece of information that I can then share with a reader who may be unsure whether or not they believe a conspiracy theory or not. And certainly I have to trust that the person who's telling me that is telling me the right thing. And there's a lot of layers that go into anything like that. But as I said before, a big part of our job is just trying to understand what is the consensus and what are any nuances within that conversation, and presenting that to readers so that they can have more context to make decisions about what items on social media they may want to believe or not believe. So I think that one of the things that, when I was reflecting after Dr. Hassan asked me to participate in this, one of the things that I was reflecting on was this idea of wildlife vilified. And I think I'll echo Dr. Epstein's points as well, that really it's the bottom line for me in my reporting of really my biggest takeaway is it's not about the animals, but it's about the way that humans interact with their environment. And from the from the perspective of how to incorporate that into our journalistic coverage, we see that throughout the course of this pandemic, or from the outbreak over these past 11 months, that there's been so many hypotheses that haven't been correct, or that we still don't know if they're correct, or theories are shifting. And I mean, many of you are scientists. I don't need to tell you that hypotheses change. So as, for example, the wet market, which was so central in the beginning, now is perhaps by many thought, especially scientists within China, is thought that it was perhaps not the ground zero for the outbreak, but instead just a site where it was amplified and the virus had already been spreading among humans. So as all of these details are shifting, and of course with different outbreaks, the specifics are always going to be different. So how do we also provide some more context for readers about what is the big picture here? What does this actually mean? What is the body of scientific evidence saying about the risk for emerging infectious disease? And so that's where I think journalism can really add value if we're able to also really provide that big picture context, that it's the relationship between human practices and emerging disease that is really how we use land, how we're cutting down on biodiversity. These are kind of the when you zoom out, these are the bottom line issues that connect all of these different outbreaks, and that even as the small details may change or we learn more about where this came from, most likely it will be within this larger context. And so actually I can speak just not even as a reporter, but as a reader too, and as understanding which of my articles my own readers really connected with. And certainly it was the ones where I was able to explain some of the context of this relationship, and also provide maybe some more insight about what are some of the solutions. Can we support certain policies that may enhance biodiversity, or how do we understand even the products that we're choosing to buy at the supermarket? Are some of those contributing to land use change that may be driving risk at a human-animal interface? These kinds of things, being able to really make sure that we're including that bigger picture. And so I'm, again, really grateful to the scientists, and present company included, that I've spoken with about these issues. So let's see, I've totally lost track of time here, but I think I have maybe just one more minute to just kind of, in case this was useful, I thought that I would perhaps just give a brief overview from my side of the interview chair, what I'm thinking when I'm interviewing an expert, in case, and I'd be happy to, if any scientists have any feedback for me about my interviewing, then that would be certainly well accepted. But one of the things that I'm always really interested in when I'm speaking with a scientist or an expert is the process of how you're uncovering what you uncover. For example, if a researcher is telling me that they're doing serological testing so that they can understand what the risk is for communities who are living at the border of wildlife habitats, I can certainly write that line in my article, but if I'm able to ask you, what does that actually mean? And you describe to me how you have a relationship with a local clinic and its patients, where when they get a blood sample taken for something else, that's handed over to your laboratory with their permission, and you're then being able to test that for all different kinds of viral families to understand what the risks might be, what are viruses that are crossing over that then may emerge. That really can illustrate what that work is like, and draw our readers into the scientific process more, so that we're all maybe more united in what this work is, and how prevention happens, and policymakers as well. I think another thing that can be important is sometimes we look at these, I think we saw this with this outbreak, where there wasn't a lot of, we saw this with this outbreak where there maybe wasn't a lot of reaction in places like the United States immediately when, well, I should say kind of the expert commentary is that there wasn't a lot of really fast reaction when the outbreak was happening in China. What kind of preparation needs to be taken in the United States? Do we see this as something that's just happening far away from us? But if we're also able to draw in local examples, like I'm from the Northeast of the United States, and so Lyme disease is a really big problem where I'm from, which comes from ticks. And I only in the course of my reporting on this topic learned that land use change in the US, where there was a lot of forests that were cleared and biodiversity destroyed, and then forests were replanted as they were changing into a more suburban landscape, that helps to drive the number of deer and the number of deer ticks, which spread Lyme disease in that region. So being able to connect into how this really shows up in different communities is also, I think, an important way for us to understand how this affects everyone, and how there's communities, how we can all think about it on a local level as well. Another one is just an example or an illustration that really gets at the heart of it. And I think with One Health, something like rabies, and maybe this is sort of a textbook example, and it's certainly perhaps an oversimplification, but just something so straightforward, like if you have a dog that bites a person and they get rabies, and then that person is treated in a hospital, but no one is speaking to the veterinarian about what's happening with that dog, then it can just keep happening again. And so that's a really straightforward way that I can describe to a reader, why is it important for people to communicate across disciplines. So I guess the other parts that I'm always interested to know is really what's the bottom line for the public or for policymakers. What should they know, and what am I myself missing that I should be thinking about? So I'm sorry, I think I've totally gone over my time here because I can't see any of my clock when I'm in this presenter view. But thank you so much for listening, and I welcome any questions that you guys might have afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simone. That was very, very interesting, and so great to see like the different views. And we are the consumers of news, and with this current infodemic, especially when people have nothing else better to do, everybody's stuck at home. There's a lot of information coming in, and you have to struggle sieving between all these multiple sources of news, and trying to find ethical and balanced reports became something of a great challenge. How do you differentiate news and quasi-news? Because all the information they just get read in, and apparently a lot of people have a lot of time to make up news. So yeah, it's a big struggle. So Simone, if you have the chance, in the chat box, there's some questions for you. Maybe you can think about that while we move on to the next presentation. And before we go to the next presenter, we have two fresh poll question for you guys, and please go ahead and spend a minute on that. Thank you. Admin, if you are ready, we can have the poll results. Okay, so most of us agree that wildlife conservation definitely will help to prevent against future pandemics. And yes, many of us get upset when a certain animal species get labeled for pathogen emergence. So with that kind of introduction, I would like to introduce you to the next speaker, Prof. Dato Muhammad Tajuddin Abdullah. So how are you, Prof, today?
I'm fine, thank you.
Thank you so much for agreeing to be with us today. So Prof. Dato, he asked me to call him Mr. T, but he's not the highly accessorized Mr. T with the multiple gold and silver appendages. So he's the Academy of Science Fellow of Malaysia. He was a professor at UNIMAS, University Malaysia Sabah, and now he is with University Malaysia Terengganu. He was elected and inducted as the Fellow of Academy of Science Malaysia in 2013. His research disciplines are in zoology, molecular ecology, biodiversity, and protected area management. In 1970 to 1980, he did research on Sumatran rhino conservation. In 1990, he conducted research in diversity, distribution, population, ecology, and species conservation and their natural habitats in Peninsula and Borneo. So his research is like very well-rounded and very relevant for today's, and right now his interest is in zoonosis, genome and metagenomic of primates. So he also did a lot of research on orang asli, sustainability, canopy species diversity, colonial landscape, and wetlands in Terengganu. So basically he is very appropriate for today's talk. And Prof. Taj, the floor is yours.
Terima kasih, Prof. Latifah. Good morning, everybody. I'm asking the administration to put up the slide because I'm on 3G and it will be a lot of interruption from my side. Do I have the slides? Okay, anyway, I've been working on the wildlife in Malaysia since 1977 and have been working in Peninsula, Borneo, in Thailand, as well as part of Indonesia. And initially I was involved with the Sumatran rhino until during our lifetime, we can see that the animal have been extinct. So at the present time, we have about 372 species of mammal in terms of the biological species, genetic species, as well as morphological species. And out of that number, you have 70 species are endangered and 2 species are already extinct. There's the Sumatran rhino and the Javan rhino. Then after a while, we moved into working with the genetics, and there we discovered a lot of cryptic species that if you put in your hand, it looks similar, but when you do the DNA sequencing, it might be 10% genetic divergent. So it's a lot of problem to those people working in the field, because the books doesn't really tell you what is actually what. For instance, if you're working on the small mammal or on the bats, it might look alike, but actually there are more than one species within the species complex. And people are still describing new species from the morphological point of view as well as from the genetic point of view. And then we move on working on the primates. We got some grants from MGRC and as well as from internal grant from the University of Malaysia, Sarawak. And during that time, we have various students working on the small mammal as well as on primates, various species of primates. I think that previously Dr. Jaya Raj was working on the bats, genetics of the bats. Dr. Jeffrin was working on the genetics of primates. Not either sequenced the whole genome of Nasalis levatus. And we have Dr. Taya working on leptospirosis. We also collaborate with the other people in the other faculty, Professor Laila Sood, as well as in IMR, we were collaborating with Dr. Mariana. Then, of course, I was fortunate to work with the late Lim Boliat, who have given us a lot of idea what to work on and where to find those animals and so on. And during that process, we work on the bacteria. And can I have the slides on the hypothetical next? Next. Okay, these are some general aspects of infectious disease outbreak. If you have a lot of biody, then these are the source of your pathogen. And the zoonotic disease outbreak is positively correlated with the number of threatened mammals and birds. And they also found out that the loss of biodiversity is associated with the increasing zoonotic diseases and vector-borne diseases. Next slide. Okay, I think John have explained about this. When you have habitat, you have the bat reservoir, as well as the intermediate host, as well as sometimes in the host you have a lot of other things. The parasites, you have blood parasites, you have internal parasite, you have the external parasite, and also you have mosquito who can fly around and bites a human at the forest edges. Next. So one student, Dr. Chong Yiling, was working on E. coli, and we have very interesting observation at Nia Cave National Park. Apparently, the E. coli loading was very high in the insect beds. But when she worked in in Bako National Park, the fruit beds have high loading of E. coli. The differences is because of different ecosystem that they are living in. The insect bed are feeding on contaminated arthropod and also contaminated water. Then these animals or the birds are sometimes being in contact with human. Human might be hunting for them, and some, I know some of the bats be consumed by the local community. Next. So in Bako National Park is a tropical lowland forest. You have lots of fruit-eating bats, but then the E. coli load is very high compared to the insect-feeding bats. So when we look at how does the E. coli enter into the system is through the long-tailed macaque that are walking on the ground around the park area, scavenging the waste and also discarded food in the bin. And then the same long-tailed macaque will climb the tree and will be touching, feeding on the fruit bunches. And in that process, the fruits will be contaminated. Then at night, the fruit bats will come out and ingesting all those contaminated figs. So that's the process of how you have various hosts that bring your pathogen into the system. Next. We were working around university campus in Borneo, and we checked the bloods from both animals and also the communities, the local communities, and found that they were positive of leptospira. And so we informed the top management that we might have some problem because all around here we have positive cases of leptospira. So one day we really have a reported case of leptospirosis in the hostels, in the campus. So when I investigated, a lot of those cleaners in the campus were from the kampong that live next door to our campus. So we published the data, and also we found some of this lepto are not only from rodent, but they are from carnivore and also from primates. So I don't know how you get into the other animals, but you can read all these papers that we have published. So what we really concerned is that there's no SOP on health or the safety of people working in the field, as well as people in contact with other people on campus or in the office that are the potential carrier of those diseases. Next. Malaria is done by our colleague, Professor Balbir Singh. So I'm just reading his papers. I think their group was working in deep forests, and they were logging the forest for commercial timber. And while they were logging, those trucks, the timber truck, leave very deep tire track on the ground, as well as those big leaves would curl up and be collecting rainwater during the monsoon. And that really become the breeding ground for the mosquito. And the fact that the tropical rainforest had been disturbed, it pushed away the animal to go closer to the villages for shelter, for food, and so on. And apparently, a lot of these animals are long-tailed macaque. And this is where I think Professor Balbir Singh discovered that Plasmodium nosai in long-tailed macaque jump from animal into human. So the other problem was that the doctors were not trained to detect Plasmodium nosai. So they were prescribing the normal malaria medicine, which would not be effective for those people who got malaria. So I think this is well reported in the journal by Professor Balbir's group. Next. I think John have spent a lot of time talking about the virus. I think his group with Dezek, Hume Field, Andrew Breed, and so on have been doing excellent job. I would not dwell on this, but I'm just putting up a very small slide to show how does the sequence of event. So you have the flying fox with Nipah virus feeding on the foods, and some of the leftover been contaminated with the saliva ingested with farm animal, and unfortunately it got into the piggeries in Malaysia, and we have, I think, about 276 cases with 106 deaths. And I think later on, they have to cull about 1 million pigs in Malaysia. And there was a very big, I think about 20 billion of economic loss to the country in terms of export value. And there are several issues there. Do you really have a farm SOP? Do you have this safety certification be enforced in all the farm, or just a rubber stamp sort of thing being done across the country, or do they really check, take the swab and look for the organism? And I was really sad that they were killing the flying fox population, that the suspect being the carrier. So the other irony is that flying fox is protected species in Malaysia. So at the end of the day, we would call the protected species rather than we think about SOP and so on. Next. We were working with the Orang Asli since 2016 and found that the Orang Asli, as well as those indigenous in Sarawak, they were using amphibian, reptile, birds, and mammal for their subsistence as well as for their livelihood. And there was never any issue of SOP or health risks and so on. And this is I'm concerned about this because most of these indigenous people are a matter of their survival, whether they have food on the table or they don't have food on the table. But how are we going to, let's say, ask them to test every animal when they were collecting? Or are we going to ask them to wear PPE while they were hunting for animals? So this sort of question that we have to address. And the other thing is that their education is very low. You cannot talk on a very high technical level, because I've been trying to say something like that. They were saying, well, you can talk because you have your salary. This is a matter of our survival to find food and eat. Next slide. So I think John have covered also this, but I'm going to talk about just the, you are correct, John, that we can do intervention at level 2, the disturbances, and at level 3, by having a certain policy, certain laws, and also certain practices that might benefit and that might break the change of the disease in our community. Next. yeah, the two previous speakers have also mentioned about this, but in Malaysia, I think there are a lot of groups working in silo. So I'm not particularly working on infectious disease, but because I'm working on mammal, I have to work something about certain disease and find out how they are connected to science as well as to the local people. So the biggest problem I was facing that point of time was to have sustainable financing. So at one point of time, we presented our proposal to the Minister of Education, to the Director General of Higher Learning, and to everybody. And at the end of the day, they say, sorry, Taj, your work is not useful at this point of time. So that was in 2013. That was 7 years ago that I was asking for money to look into the problem of transmission of disease and so on. And I'm still having the proposal in my hand, and we are not getting any funding for that. We also tried to set up a biosafety lab level 2+. That also we cannot do because they say, well, you don't have money, we don't have money, and you don't need that because you are a zoologist. So what can I do about that? Then I feel those people working in the wildlife disease surveillance, they should have properly trained biologists, virologists, and zoologists. It must be at higher level degree. You can't have a bachelor degree student then working in the high profile research. You need a better person with better concept theories and way of doing things. We need somebody to communicate. Scientists are the lousiest person to communicate. They cannot communicate. You need somebody, you need a reporter or a communicator to talk to the local people, to talk to the policymaker, to talk to the grant agency and so on. So I think for the future, we also need to look at our law. There are a lot of species that are being protected, but we are killing them. And I think the wildlife department should advise on that. And with that, thank you very much, Prof. Latifah.
Thank you so much, Dato, for a very interesting overview on what is being currently performed at the country level in terms of conservation. I'm sorry, I lost my word. Conservation and what you are doing, and a lot of your work is very One Health in terms of its spirit. And I truly appreciate the comprehensiveness of you engaging the different sectors in your work. Thank you for that. To those who just joined us, thank you very much for joining us, and welcome. If you just joined us to the One Health webinar under MyOHUN Malaysia One Health University Network. We are talking about wildlife, the misconception about wildlife in the age of pandemics. And we have three very important subject matter experts with us, Dr. John Epstein, Simon McCarthy, and Prof. Dato Tajuddin Abdullah. And we are on to the next session, which is a very important session, which is the Q&A. If you look at the chat window, you will see there has been many participants who have written down questions for the speakers to address. We probably will not have time to address all these questions. In fact, on a standby, I have a few questions with me to ask the speakers, but I don't think I will need them just because I don't think we can even go through what we have already in the chat box. So quickly, let's just go through the questions. And I hope the speakers have had the chance to look at the questions by which has been posed. And maybe I can summarize some of these questions up for you because some of the questions are very relevant to each other. Okay. So maybe for the first speaker, Dr. Esteem John, how do you see the emergence of SARS coronavirus 2? Is it much earlier than the reported 2019? Sometimes people debate about this on TV. What do you think? And how do you foresee that given all the work that you have done so far in emerging pathogens in terms of its emergence, is that something that you have expected so far, or is that something that has been the conversation among the scientific community, the virus hunters? Go ahead, John.
Sure, thank you. Well, maybe I'll start with the second half of your question, and that is that among those who have been studying coronaviruses and understanding their natural history, the current pandemic is surely not a surprise, and you know, we've been looking at coronaviruses in bats since the connection was discovered in 2003, 2004 with SARS. And we've just found an enormous diversity of viruses, of coronaviruses. And it really looks as though bats are an original reservoir for the family of mammalian, the subgroup of mammalian coronaviruses, and in particular, the SARS-like, the beta coronaviruses. And so the idea that we see these periodic outbreaks of zoonotic coronaviruses like Middle East respiratory syndrome and SARS and SARS-CoV-2 really shouldn't be a surprise, and it's unfortunate that it's happened. Now, having said that, we really still don't know or understand exactly how SARS-CoV-2 made its way into people. The best information we have to date suggests that this is a virus that evolved in horseshoe bats over some period of time and has potentially been circulating in human populations or communities earlier than November 2019. So again, and Simone alluded to this in her coverage of the progress of information we had, the progression, the earliest cluster of pneumonia cases that were associated with that Wuhan market were important in recognizing this phenomena of COVID-19, but they weren't the earliest cases. And in fact, as we learned more, some of those very earliest cases that were identified in December of 2019 had no association with that market, and in fact may have even been infected outside of Wuhan. And so what has to happen now is a really concerted effort to look at archival serum samples from clinical patients with pneumonia, dating as far back into 2019 as we can, to see if there's evidence for infection with SARS-CoV-2. That would help us understand how long it's been circulating. But I don't think we know strictly from the genetics exactly when this made the jump from bats into people, but I think the general sense is that it is earlier than the epidemiologic evidence we have for the first cases. So probably it spilled over earlier in 2019 and was probably circulating in bats for many years before that. But we really need to understand this from epidemiologic investigations to get a better sense of when it perhaps spilled over. Thanks.
Okay, on a related question, there's a few questions like that I see in the chat box. There's some conspiracy theory saying that the virus originated from the Wuhan lab, and maybe this question can be posed to John, and again, and later maybe Simone can add to this. It's just on how reporting is important, and how do you make sure that there is balance? I mean, is there any truth to this? And some people would think that there is, and many believe that it's not true. So how do you convince those parties who believe that this is to be blamed on Wuhan lab or China, for example, to what is probably facts, which is it did not originate from the Wuhan lab or for example?
Well, maybe I can start and then hand off to Simone on the communication aspects of this. I'll start by saying there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever, zero credibility to the idea that this originated in the laboratory. And to the contrary, the preponderance of evidence we have scientifically is consistent with a natural spillover, a natural emergence events. In other words, there's a lot of evidence that relates this virus to other similar viruses carried by horseshoe bats, like we know about from SARS and, as I mentioned, of other related viruses. And like so many emerging zoonoses in the past, there's some spillover point, some opportunity where that virus in nature makes the jump from animals into people. But there's never been any evidence presented to support the conspiracy theory that this started in the laboratory. And there's a lot of reasons why it didn't. So I'll just leave it at that. There's no credibility to that, and maybe hand off to Simone to talk about conspiracy theories and why they're so easy to believe sometimes. Over to you.
Simone, I think you need to unmute yourself.
Oh, yep, got it. Thank you. So I think obviously social media has been a really important development in how people around the world can express themselves. But one of the problems that we do see with social media is if you're getting all of this information from everywhere, and what are actually the reliable sources, and everyone can kind of share their viewpoint on an equal platform, which definitely has benefits on the one hand, but then on the other hand, if it's where is this information actually coming from? What is the provenance of the information and the factual basis for it? And so from a media perspective, it's really important for us to be able to take what we're seeing people saying and actually check it and put it in context for our readers alongside what the scientific consensus is. And so that means reaching out to experts, like Dr. Epstein, and taking his quote of what he just said and including in our article, but also digging in and trying to also verify, is there any factual basis for this, in addition to what is the consensus from the scientific community. And so our articles have said, again and again, that the scientific community says there's no basis for this, and that nature really is the perfect laboratory to create this kind of viral spillover. And so, I think that's obviously the media has come under a lot of fire recently, but the true importance of having media as opposed to only social media is that we really are meant to put this in context, reach out to experts, and try and really help our readers to better see how this really fits in with the expert opinion.
We're going to move on to the question on communication and what gets to the public, asked by a few of the participants, like how much are you under pressure and how much are you dictated by, for example, by your editor and perhaps, for example, in the US, for example, Fox News, they are very pro, Trump, and as opposed to CNN. So the reporting is very heavy based on the inclination of the media. So what if you decided to report something that your editor completely do not like? So do you have a say?
Right. Yeah, I think that's such an important question. So basically, what has happened in the media environment in recent years is that there has been a lot of, certain news outlets have taken a very clear political stance. So I would say that there's a spectrum in the media industry where there's specific outlets that have a political stance and on one side or the other. And then there's also outlets whose aim is to be objective and not take a stance on one side or the other. And so that's certainly the category that my news organization would fall into, and a lot of major newspapers around the world, whether or not you may criticize their coverage or not, their specific goal is to print articles that are just bringing, as we say, truth to power, as opposed to particularly trying to go after, in the US context, a Republican or a Democrat. They're trying to just make sure that people in power are accountable to the public. And so that's really how we see ourselves as well. And so I think it's important to distinguish between news outlets that may have a specific political agenda on one side, or perhaps they have like a network like Fox News, they may have a certain TV presenters or certain shows which are more politically opinionated than others, whereas they may also be, well, I'm not so familiar actually with Fox News coverage these days, so I shouldn't be speculating too much about it. Unfortunately, you know, my television is very limited from US, but in any case, I think that really from my perspective on the specific question of, am I limited in something that I'm reporting on? If I'm trying to report a story that doesn't have a factual basis, then yes, my editor will definitely limit me. But if I'm presenting the facts about an issue that is important to our readers, then no, certainly not. The most important thing is that we're able to share the most accurate and relevant information for our readers around the world. So thank you.
So, but maybe my personal question is that sensationalism is sometimes has been used as a strategy to get people to read more news.
Yeah.
And sound bites. So how do you balance that between telling like boring facts to the fact that you also want to sell your newspaper?
Yeah, I mean, and especially these days when we're you know, in the online media environment, and you're interested in making sure that you have a lot of people reading your articles and all of that. And I think what it comes down to is, are you selling a specific story, or are you selling your media brand? And if you're selling your brand, then you are basing, you know, everything is based on your integrity and on whether people can trust the information. So if they start coming to you and every time they're seeing some outrageous headline that makes them want to click on it, but then it's obviously not what's really happening, or the story says something different than the headline, that's not really going to be the news organization that you go back to when you want to figure out what's really happening with an important issue. And so for news organizations that are really trying to be, you know, that source for people around the world, that's not going to be the model that they're basing on.
Thank you. Maybe I'll move on to the next speaker, Prof. Dato. There's a question here for you. How does tradition or civilization practices give different hypotheses in taking the role of this of human action that lead to human-animal conflict? Plus, can that contribute to various transmission of zoonotic diseases? Or the idea of proving the knowledge facts in the rural is less? So I hope you have a chance, had a chance to look at this question, and maybe can you respond to that?
Yeah, it's a very complicated situation. What we observe in the fields that, for example, the orang asli would take from the forest that animal or that fish that they want to eat for that day. Okay? But I've seen a Chinese hunter shoot hundreds of flying fox and line up at the roadside, and he was saying he would consume or give to some friends and so on. So there's a difference between orang asli and the non-orang asli, on the non-indigenous people, would really disturb the population. So the indigenous people, they are with the ecosystem, they take what they want. They just would, for instance, they will cut a tree and dig a canoe out of that tree. But for a businessman, they would bring a bulldozer and fell the whole area, and that would disrupt the ecosystem, disrupt the physical structure of the forest. That's where the problem started. So even the orang asli or indigenous people have no knowledge, but they are living inside with the ecosystem. They know what they are doing. And the businessmen are talking about profits, and then the health people are trying to do damage control. This is the problem, that we have been disconnected.
Thank you, Dato. So on the question of culling, like we had that whole question asking our participants about whether they agree or not that while some wild animals should be culled to control emerging infectious pathogen from emerging in the population. So and a large proportion of the people in this audience agreed that there should be some kind of like culling. So my question to you is that throughout the history of culling selected wild animals against certain type of diseases, how has that helped, and how logical is it to do that?
I agree with culling to control the disease, but make sure you have your evidence. You don't just cull because they are flying fox. So, so now you are stereotyping that all flying fox are having certain type of disease. So it might be certain population or certain area, but not all of them would carry those diseases. But for the domestic animal, yes, I would agree. You need to cull them. They cull 1 million pigs. But I disagree if they bury the animal alive. They should kill it in a humane way, and it should not lead to any problem of animal ethics and so on. So yes, you can cull the animal in order to protect the others, the human population, but you shouldn't be culling all the animals that you think. You don't have any evidence, you just think. You look at the one species, you say, this may be. In fact, for a lot of other species, your dogs and cats are also carriers, but they are not culling them. So, so you have to check even your pets at home. Thank you.
Latifa?
Thank you, Dato. Maybe I'll pose the same question to John. John, because bat has been named again and again as the origin of multiple viruses. So some politician or decision makers sometimes decided to selectively cull bats in certain areas to prevent humans from contracting the virus. So what is your opinion on that?
Yeah, I wonder if I could present a slightly different perspective than Prof. Tajuddin, in that, you know, certainly for domestic animals, stamping out a disease, sometimes it is necessary to cull, but with wildlife, there are different things that have to be considered. And I think this also speaks to the importance of how we report in the media on disease, on epidemics that are linked to wildlife. And that is that a lot of wildlife, most wildlife, play important ecological roles in an ecosystem. And while we're on the subject of bats, and yes, bats have been associated with a number of emerging zoonoses, but bats themselves are incredibly important ecologically. The fruit-eating bats are seed dispersers and pollinators, and the insectivorous bats play a crucial role in controlling agricultural pests in the insects that they eat. And when we start to lose those animals, when we start to try to remove animals in a population, there's impact on our agriculture, on our livelihoods, and generally it doesn't actually improve or reduce the risk of getting infected by the diseases they may carry. And so it's not enough to just know that a wild animal may carry a virus that can cause human disease. You have to go beyond that and understand how common or rare an infection is it, and how is it transmitted to people? Because a better strategy than culling is to disrupt the route of transmission. If important animals, ecologically important animals, also happen to carry a virus that, if it gets into people, can make them sick, then figure out how it's happening and stop it
protect the food resource, protect livestock, create barriers between people and the wildlife so that disease transmission doesn't occur. It's a better strategy. And we have evidence that culling can actually make disease transmission worse. There was a study done in Uganda looking at bats that carry Marburg virus, which is related to Ebola. These are Rosetus aegyptiacus, which is the Egyptian rosetted bat, very common fruit bat across Africa and the Middle East. And they were living in mines in Uganda, and there was an outbreak of Marburg. And in response, people sought to exterminate bats from the mine in which they were living, which is where people got exposed. So they put up nets and they culled and they removed bats from that mine. And what happened, it became a vacant habitat and other bats moved in. And in the transition process, the rate of transmission of Marburg among bats actually was higher than it was before in the population that was already living there. So the risk of spillover and human infection was actually increased by attempting to cull bats and remove them from that environment. So as we start to have a more sophisticated understanding of how diseases spill over from wildlife, we really need to focus on interface and routes of transmission rather than trying to eliminate the animals that carry the virus.
Thank you, John. Simone, do you have anything to add to that? What's the responsibility of media when a certain species of wild animals, some of them are protected, being blamed for pathogen, and there are efforts to cull them?
Well, I think as with any kind of reaction that's being taken by health authorities or animal authorities in a specific country, we would just want to make sure that we had all of the relevant information about what their justification was for going through those actions, and then also being able to compare that information with what local experts outside of the government had, what their perspective was on that. So I think we wouldn't necessarily take a stance on it so much as trying to draw together a lot of voices, people who are living in that community, experts who are engaging that community, as well as what the government officials are saying to kind of verify what the what the basis is for such an action.
And Latifah, if I can add to that as well, we as scientists have a responsibility also when we're studying systems of zoonotic disease, but also when we're speaking to journalists and to the media, to provide the balance, the messaging, not only about the virus that is the headline part of it, what is making people sick, but the animals that carry them and what we know about the importance of those animals. And I think one of the fundamental issues that is creating friction between the bat conservation community and the public health community, or at least the virologists who are studying zoonotic viruses that have been linked to bats, is that there's often not enough attention paid to that balanced message of, hey, these viruses are bad news when they get into people, but they're naturally carried by bats. They don't actually cause disease in the bats that carry them many times, or if they do, it's more mild. And really the issue is about understanding what people are doing to allow spillover to occur, rather than the fact that bats carry a horrific disease and we should be really afraid of these bats. And so I think we as scientists actually have to do a better job at delivering a balanced message when it comes to the ecology around disease, rather than focusing solely on the pathogen and the scary human health outcomes that can result. Over.
Right. There's a question for you, John. How long scientists can go back to confirm regional or local outbreaks of zoonosis? Humans and wildlife must have always had many contacts. Therefore, the possible difference between an outbreak 5,000 years ago and present may merely be the size of that outbreak and whether it has been properly recorded or not. So what's your comment on that?
Yeah, it's an excellent comment and question. I mean, there is no doubt that throughout the history of civilization, especially as we started to develop cities and bring our livestock with us into situations where we were living in higher density, we started to see more and more zoonotic disease outbreaks and diseases that became endemic. And a good example of that is measles virus, which now is squarely a human virus, but its origins historically come from rinderpest, which was a cattle disease that dates back to biblical times. Okay, and so it's just one of those illustrations, and a lot of veterinarians have heard this before too, that we have a long history of association with our animals, and we do share diseases. But the truth is, objectively speaking, and there's evidence to support that we are seeing an acceleration in zoonotic disease emergence. We are seeing more and more events happening in recent history over the past 2-3 decades than we have in history. And that is largely due to the expansion of human population, the way that we're altering the environment. So land use change, but also travel, and the way that travel and trade, and the way that populations are connected in ways they never were historically. So it used to be perhaps that viruses or diseases might spill over in a remote setting and not really cause much of a problem. But now we're seeing more and more opportunity for small localized outbreaks to become regional outbreaks. Not to mention our surveillance systems are more sensitive, so we're actually detecting them better. But that isn't the reason in and of itself that we're seeing more outbreaks. We're statistically seeing more emergence events because of the way that we're having increased contact with wildlife. And so we just need to start taking this a lot more seriously, or it's going to continue to get worse. Over.
Thank you, John. Prof. Taj, I have a question for you. So what are the positive and negative impacts on the pandemic towards conservation and wildlife trade? Because wildlife trade, as you saw in John's presentation, and also Simon and your presentation, is a big issue. So has there been any negative or positive impact on wildlife trade?
I think illegal taking of wildlife is ongoing. We just put up a paper with Dr. Rahim Shah, and we saw people are taking illegally wildlife during the control movement period. So you have a law, or you try to enforce the law, people are still doing that illegally. So I don't know how much in terms of illegal trade, but we hope the wildlife authorities, IUCN and traffic would help to stem out illegal trade, because they are encouraging the local community to sell wildlife, because this is a sort of easy money. They think of the forest as their ATM machine to get free money. And if you can cut off those traders, the middlemen, these are middlemen, and we might be able to cut off the illegal trade. The problem is in Malaysia, you have illegal hunters that came all the way from Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar. And the local, we have the local runners that would take them and send them to the forest and collect those animals that they were hunting. So I believe the wildlife department are working with the army as well as the police to stem out illegal hunting and illegal trade. And this is something very serious. It's a national issue, and it's very hard to stop unless we can get all those middlemen. These are businessmen running the industry illegally throughout the world. And most of this illegal thing will go to Hong Kong, and from Hong Kong it will go to China. So China being the biggest market for our species in Malaysia. So every year we have thousands of cases in Malaysia, and I think the wildlife department are having a horrible time to catch them, because they will come out when after 5 o'clock. They are in the business until the next morning, and we don't have enough resources, enough equipment, also enough money. And if you think of Sabah and Sarawak, the area is huge, very, very large area, and it's very difficult to contain illegal hunting and illegal trade. So we need to educate our public, to educate everybody, to work with the army, the police, as well as maybe to have citizen scientists to appoint rangers among the villages to safeguard our wildlife so that it won't be taken away by illegal hunters.
Thank you, Dato, for that answer. And wildlife trade is certainly a very important conservation issue, but how much has that contributed to emerging pathogens? John, if you can answer that.
Sorry, the question is how much is the illegal?
How much has wildlife trade been associated or linked to emerging pathogens?
Well, I think that there are several good examples where it has, and probably SARS is the best one, where we see wildlife having been brought into urban markets that led to the emergence of a pandemic virus. But other examples include H5N1 influenza that was moved into Europe through the trade in raptors and birds that were infected. We've seen, as I mentioned, monkeypox come into the United States through the importation. Now that wasn't illegal, but it was through the pet trade. And so wildlife trade, whether illegal or legal, really involves the movement of animals around the world, and typically exotic animals, so animals being taken from one environment brought to the other. Just last week, I think there was an article in the United States describing that there was an illegal export of flying squirrels from Florida, from the southeast United States. And flying squirrels are native to the United States, but were clearly desired as pets. There were 3,000 of them that were being illegally sent over to China. And flying squirrels happen to also be a reservoir for scrub typhus, which is a bacterial disease that can be fatal in people. So, as we move animals around the world, so too do we move their pathogens. We create risk for not only exposure to those pathogens, but introduction into native wildlife of those pathogens too. And so we really have to be aware of that. And I think the wildlife trade in general poses a risk for that. Thanks.
Simon, do you have anything to add on wildlife trade, legal or illegal?
Not really. I think that those were both quite in-depth responses. I mean, again, from my perspective, it's about trying to bring in as many of these different voices and also be able to show, I mean, the example that Professor Taj gave, I mean, that how this is really working on a local level, but there's a number of international players who are involved there. What are the ways that media can also work to show that this is going on and perhaps inform policymakers as well? So I'm grateful to learn a little bit more about that from the insights today.
Okay, so we are 3 minutes away from 11:30. So maybe I can just go around the panel and ask for a concluding remark from each of you. John, you first.
Well, reflecting back on the theme, I think, of this whole discussion, which, by the way, I've really enjoyed, thank you again, is that we have to really be mindful to stay focused on the reason that we see epidemics and pandemics. And it is because of human activities, and it is because of things we do that bring us into increased contact with wildlife. And so we just need to find ways to live more safely and better with the natural environment around us, not in spite of it. We shouldn't be trying to clear it or get rid of it, but just recognize that some of the things we will continue to be doing will create risk. And the more we can protect ecosystems and natural environments, the healthier we will be in the end as well. So there's a real incentive to try to be mindful of that relationship. And I think it's something we need to do a better job at communicating to the public and also within the scientific community to do a better job at developing evidence for policymakers to really change the way we do things to reduce the risk of epidemics. So, thank you.
Thank you, John. How about you, Simon?
Well, Yes, I should certainly say I'm so grateful to have been able to be part of this conversation today. Thank you for inviting me and listening to my perhaps too long comments. But I do think that this has really been such a watershed moment as the largest pandemic in any of our lifetimes. And so from my perspective as a reporter, I think it's really, and all of the conversations that I've had with members of the scientific community, as well as people whose lives have been affected by this, it's certainly something that I will continue to carry forward in my work, even after this pandemic is part of our, hopefully part of our memory, and not a reality that we're living day to day. And I think that we all, whatever our field is, have a responsibility to continue to incorporate these issues and the importance of prevention, and also the importance of these big picture of how we all contribute to this, and what our responsibility is as humans living on this planet. So I, for one, if you come across me in a few years and I haven't been doing any reporting on that, please hold me to task. And thank you again so much, everyone, for I'm grateful to be able to speak here, and also to hear such insights coming from both the questions and the fellow speakers.
Thank you, Simone. Prof. Taj, do you have any last remarks or conclusion?
Thank you for having me. Also, I'm learning a lot from Simone and also from John. We human need biodiversity because you cannot manufacture animals or construct something out of nothing for the biody. You cannot do your pollination unless you have all the birds and the bats. But at the same time, they are having like 1.7 million viruses. There's a lot of viruses with those animals. And I don't think the biologists know a lot of them. And we need to keep our knowledge current, as well as we need to keep the animal healthy. We need to stamp out the illegal hunting and to cut off illegal trade. We appeal to the federal government to help all those wildlife authorities in Peninsula, Sabah, and Sarawak to do their job, monitor wildlife, as well as maybe to have a lot more people in research in microbiology, virology, and work in zoology to understand these animals. Thank you a lot.
Well, thank you so much. Certainly that captures One Health. Everybody needs to be working together. Nobody stays in silo. Everything is interconnected. The health of human, animals, and the environment definitely is interconnected. And none of us should be working by ourselves, no matter how territorial we are. There are times by which we have to work together. I know it's challenging. I think one of the hardest challenge for One Health is getting people to communicate, to share, and to work together, just because traditionally we have been so used to working in silo. Everybody doing their own thing. It's very comfortable, but and the pandemic COVID-19 has proved us to be wrong in our own ways, and we need to be working new ways, which is One Health approach in managing all this emerging infection. So I certainly have learned a lot from all the panelists, and definitely learn a lot from the questions asked by the participants. I apologize because we do not have enough time to address single one of them. I hope that my questions or reframing of your questions has to somewhat address some of your questions. So, and I apologize if I'm not elegant enough or not sophisticated enough to be moderating today's session. And thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. Appreciate your time from all over the globe. I know it's really late in Africa, and really late for you too, John. So appreciate you spending time with us. Thank you, everyone. Thank you again, John, Prof. Taj, and Simon. And I hope we can perhaps get together again in a different time, given a different topic. So truly, I enjoyed everything, and thank you so much. So have a good rest of the day for everyone, and have a good night, John, and have a good night, my ex-students in Africa and Myanmar and Indonesia. Thank you so much for tuning in, and all the best to everyone. Stay safe. Goodbye.
Thank you, Latif.